Good afternoon, buon pomeriggio da Palazzo Borromeo, che avete avuto modo di ammirare in questo breve filmato dove avremmo voluto ospitare questo incontro, per il quale ringrazio gli amici del Festival della Diplomazia, con cui, così come l'anno scorso, organizziamo un evento, questa volta su un tema così importante che è quello dell'indebolimento della crisi in corso del multilateralismo. Let me thank our speakers and our moderator, Professor Scarpa, as well as the so many of you that are following via streaming on Channel 4 and on the social media. First of all, the reason for today's title. I hope it's a catchy title. In 1906, the Norwegian explorer Amundsen, who had sailed just in time to escape creditors trying to stop the expedition, completed a 3-year voyage on a converted herring trawler from Europe to the Far East to demonstrate how much time and money this route would have saved. The routes from Europe to the Far East would have saved some 4,000 kilometers when compared to the Panama Canal crossing route. For years in Europe, the Northwest Passage had been a sort of a dream, not only in the movies, a dream of greater profitability, a new European competitiveness, new markets, new investments. Then the global warming, the environment is a theme on which I will return shortly, has made the impossible possible, unfortunately. In fact, in 2008, for the first time in modern history, the entire Northwest Passage and the Northeast Passage to the north of Russia opened naturally, free of ice. So much that in the autumn of 2013, the Nordic Orion was the first large ship to cross the Northern Passage of Alaska and Canada for commercial purposes. But this route is far from its real use, and we hope it will never be, because it would mean an environmental disaster. In any case, it's too late from the point of view of trade, because a passage has opened in the last 30 years, a diametrically opposite passage. I refer to the Southeast Passage towards the east, where trade, manufacturing, work, and wealth moved in amazing percentages. I say it here in the peninsula and in the southern part of Europe and the entire Mediterranean that had already experienced what it means to be significantly cut off from the main trade routes. That is when, between the 16th century and the first decades of the 17th centuries, trade from the Mediterranean moved to the ports of Northern Europe and they never really came back, with the result that the Mediterranean is still half dead in a way. If it is true, as it is true, that still today the ports between Brest and Stettin make 3 to 4 times the volume of all the ports in the Mediterranean Sea. After 2,500 years of Mediterranean-centric economy and trade, followed by 500 years of an Atlantic-centered one, now we are in front of the explosion, or the overwhelming return, if you will, of the Asian economies on the world stage. In the last 30 years, we have seen the surge in trade and interchange with new global value chains, which are the expression of the new globalization, such as components of goods conceived in one country and produced and assembled in various other countries. At first, envisaging that this would also really benefit whole countries, starting with the least developed ones. In fact, so far, too many countries have unfortunately remained on the sidelines. Others have not been able to stay hooked to the increasingly rapid technological advances, and for that reason, to take real profit from the global value chains. We are indeed living in an era of great transition, defined by some commentators as the era of chaos, or rather, one could say, the age of hybrid systems. Hybrid system where we can see operating side by side different economic and social political models stemming out by capitalism roots, but which often also combine antagonistic aspects. We are in fact in a transition historical phase, puzzled with its economic, political, and cultural multipolarity, in search of a new stability, an era of great socio-cultural transition, where concerns are often raised about the impact of globalization on people's work and life, on their families, and on their communities. Many argue that the present model of globalization has caused, just to name a few, an extreme financialization of the economy, the weakening of income and social protection, the degradation of the environment, a progressive impoverishment of the middle class, and the polarization of wealth, especially in economically advanced countries. On top of this, the COVID-19 pandemic, which has not only triggered an unprecedented global health crisis, but also the biggest recession since World War II, adding over pre-existing weak global economic, trade and investment progressive drift. The rise of protectionism and economic nationalism are undermining decades of expansive trade and foreign investments, putting the architecture of Bretton Woods system at risk. But it's not only the Bretton Woods system in trouble. My country, as indeed the OLC and many other countries, do in fact share a great concern about the constant and progressive weakening of multilateralism, a process that, in my opinion, started right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when it became immediately clear, for instance, that the United Nations had lost their crucial position and strength of a privileged and necessary clearinghouse between the then two blocs. The European Union also slowly entered into a crisis, paradoxically in a decade, the 90s, when the enlargement process went on, as well as the Maastricht Treaty, with its financial and economic consequences. Today, faced by an unprecedented health and economic crisis, we eagerly look to measures like SURE, Next Generation, and above all, the Recovery Fund, to revive for the first time in many years European growth, cooperation, and spirit. We are convinced that despite its complexity and difficulties, multilateralism remains the most suitable instrument for guaranteeing the democratic nature, the inner cooperation, and peace within the international system to address multiple global challenges. On these premises, it is fundamental to relaunch multilateralism in the face of the distorting effects of globalization, the retreat of trust in multilateral and regional fora, and the temptation of bilateral drifts from the part of many key players. It is important to reverse this trend if we want to overcome all kinds of inequality and exploitation, build a fairer society, and create a human economy that benefits everyone and respects the environment. More precisely, international cooperation is even more essential to ensure an inclusive and balanced development. But in order to change our society and our economy, it is also essential to review the culture itself. This means not only changing the culture of work, but more generally promoting an integral humanistic culture that places at the center of focus the human person. Putting humanity back at the center sounds rhetorical, but it isn't. It is a real necessity. With the great environmental changes I mentioned, the generalized impoverishment and the exasperated financial distortions, the acceptance of a 2030 UN agenda by 188 countries in 2015 shows that we are finally beginning to understand it. The UN 2030 agenda largely incorporates the contents of the encyclical letter Laudato Si on the care of our common home of Pope Francis. It shows us that everything and everyone are connected, and therefore the guidelines for the solution to the problems of humanity require an integral approach that fights poverty, restores dignity to the excluded, and at the same time takes care of our planet. Change must therefore be oriented towards the common good and towards human, sustainable, and integral development. I would like to conclude my intervention with the extraordinary message launched by Pope Francis with his latest encyclical letter on fraternity and social friendship, Fratelli Tutti, just a few days ago, which invites all of us, people and institutions, to give our own contribution to build a better, just, and peaceful post-COVID-19 world. And I cite, a worldwide tragedy like the COVID-19 pandemic momentarily revived the sense that we are a global community, all in the same boat, where one person's problems are the problems of all. Once more, we realize that no one is saved alone. We can only be saved together. Thank you. I now leave the floor to Professor Scarpa, who will conduct the debate.
Thank you very much, His Excellency Ambassador Sebastiani, for this very important introduction to this meeting. As the title of the meeting says, this is the age of hybrid systems, and there is a huge crisis of multilateralism. And today with our speakers, the intention will be in particular to discuss about financial institutions. So we have today with us Dr. Roberta Gatti, who is a chief economist from the World Bank. I will tell you a bit more about her curriculum as soon as I will introduce her. We also have Dr. Domenico Fanizza, who is the executive director of the International Monetary Fund, as well as Father Augusto Zampini, who is adjunct secretary of the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development of the Holy See. So welcome to all the speakers, and thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you as well to Ambassador Sebastiani for virtually hosting us in your embassy, even if it's not possible to be all together in your embassy. I am sure that we all share the same feelings in terms of being here today for, one another, shaking the system as much as is it possible, for understanding how this deep crisis of multilateralism can be somehow tackled. So let me first of all introduce again then Dr. Roberta Gatti. She's chief economist of the Human Development Practice Group at the World Bank, and she co-leads the conceptualization and release of the World Bank Human Capital Index and oversees the Service Delivery Indicator Data Initiative. The floor is yours, Dr. Gatti, and you will have a maximum of 10 minutes at your disposal for your speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Scarpa, and thank you, Your Excellency, for the excellent and very kind introduction. I hope that I'll convince you that not only multilateralism is more needed than ever now, but also that it's alive and kicking. I will organize my remarks around 2 points. The first one, I've been given the rather gloomy task of summarizing some of the impacts that the COVID-19 pandemic is having on the world. And the second one will be to give a big picture overview of what the World Bank Group is doing now to respond to the pandemic and to build for the future. Now, back on the pandemic, His Excellency Sebastiani spoke about putting humans at the center. And I will also reflect on the consequences of the pandemic through a human capital and through a people's point of view. If we look back, it seems almost ironic, sadly, that the pandemic has struck the world at a time when it was healthier and more educated than ever. Right up to the pandemic, extreme poverty was also at a historical low. And this is contrary to some of the discourse that we see now. So things were going relatively well, or maybe we should say better than in the past. Now, we know that the pandemic is exacting a dramatic toll. And the first and most important dimension of that toll is the lives that it's taking. And also the consequences in terms of health for the people who had the virus and might not be able to get back to their lives as they were before. However, there's also a dramatic economic dimension to the pandemic. And His Excellency already spoke about some of the impact on global value chains and how it is changing the economic landscape of the world. Just to put some numbers in context, the forecast of the global economic prospect groups of the World Bank put the global economic world of real GDP at minus 5.2% for the world. And these were the prospects forecast for June. -7% for advanced countries, -2.5% for emerging economies. So with an impact that is relatively more muted for emerging economies. But we know now, a few months into the crisis, more than in June, that these forecasts are being revised, and they're being revised downwards. And what is happening in the world is also reallocations of the opportunity of economic growth, which looks towards some recovery in 2021, but in a very differentiated way around the world. And this already speaks to some of the inequality that the crisis has revealed in the world. These inequalities are not only at the macro side, on the aggregate side, but they are also within countries. And I'll speak to them in a minute. If we still stay at the aggregate level and at the global level, we know that poverty reduction has suffered this worst setback after nearly a quarter of century of steady progress. As you might know, the twin goals of the World Bank are eradication of extreme poverty and promotion of shared prosperity. So one of the goals of our institution is really being put into dramatic discussion. And what we know from the forecast is that anywhere between 100 million and 150 million additionally will enter the pool of the extreme poor. What we need to really acknowledge is that this crisis, even if it turns out to be a temporary one, will have long-term impacts, what economists call scarring. And these impacts will be channeled particularly through impacts on human capital. So let's just look at two angles. First, schooling. About 1.6 billion children were not in school because of the pandemics and because of the necessity of implementing these non-pharmaceutical interventions that have been considered fundamental to stave off the contagion. This has been translated in terms of productivity in a loss of about half a years of learning adjusted schooling for these children. This means that these children are likely to have, of this cohort, are likely to have lower salary when adults, and the repercussions, particularly for girls, if their attachment to school is decreased because of family needs or because of rethinking of the family budget constraint, this will have repercussions not only for these young women now, these girls now in school, but also for their children, for their daughters. If we think about health, the disruption in health services that happened at the beginning of the pandemic has already resulted in disruption in vaccination, in lower care for children, which will all result in the future in increased mortality, particularly where these services are weaker in lower and middle income countries, and increased malnutrition and stunting for children, which in turn has also implications for the ability of these children to be good learners and to be productive workers when they are adult. So this paints quite a weak picture of the pandemic's impact. What we know, however, is that these impacts will stay depending on what are the responses of governments. And this is what I would like to give you a sense of what the World Bank is doing. As I mentioned, the World Bank has these twin goals of reducing poverty, extreme poverty, eradicating it, and fostering shared prosperity, which means that we as an institution have a particular focus on the most disadvantaged groups, which now are most at risk. Not only because in a macro sense, low and middle income countries are vulnerable to shocks because they have weak health systems, they heavily rely on tourism, which has been disrupted dramatically. They rely on commodity exports, for which the demand has dropped dramatically, particularly from China, but they also have high informal labor markets. And these workers are left in precarious conditions, particularly because their work has been disrupted dramatically due to the fact that this work happens in crowded spaces, is often face-to-face, and the demand for their services might have gone down dramatically. So what is the first port of call? The first port of call is really social protection and cash transfer that can help not only sustain these non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as social distancing and lockdowns that have been necessary, but also to rebuild livelihoods for these families. Cash transfer costs money, and together with the economic crisis, what is also happening is a dramatic drop in fiscal revenues. So if the first port of call for that is raising more resources domestically, this is really the moment when multilateralism can come to help. And it can do, notwithstanding the fact that we see this crisis being one of the most synchronized crises in the world ever. But it can still help because countries are also in different moments of the rollout of this contagion. So let me just focus on what the multilateral World Bank has been doing. And then I look forward to your question. And also you will hear from Dr. Fanitz about what the IMF is doing, our sort of twin international institution across the street where we used to work. I hope I'll convince you that not only the multilateral system now is more necessary than ever, but also that it's alive and kicking. So the World Bank has approved the recon financing of up to $160 billion destined to response to the health, to the economic, and to the social shocks brought by the pandemic. This includes $50 billion of new concessional transfers from our IDA facility, and also built-in debt relief for countries that are at risk of debt distress. And the World Bank is also working very closely with the G20 in what is called the Debt Service Suspension Initiative to allow about 70 countries to suspend about $11 billion of debt service until December 2020, and hopefully also for the coming year. Something that is very close and is to my heart and is also keeping us very busy at the World Bank is our work on trying to accelerate the production and the delivery of vaccines in an equitable and fair way to low and middle income countries. And the bank has just approved a $12 billion facility to support not only the procurement, but also the delivery of such vaccines. Let me conclude with just a reflection that has thoughts that resonate with what His Excellency Bastiani said. Clearly, the pandemic is changing a lot of the life as we know it. It's changing the way we work, it's making the world currently less globalized, more digitized, and more distant. Something that I hope will happen in this sort of spirit of making the best of a dramatic solution, and probably as Winston Churchill was saying, never let a good crisis go to waste, is really an opportunity for many countries to reform what has not worked until now. And for low and middle income countries, it really means an opportunity, if the financing is there, to build stronger, more resilient health systems and education systems that really help children to grow and learn. Thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gatti, for this very interesting introduction to the work of the World Bank. And I particularly enjoyed the focus on the issues in terms of schooling, in particular for girls, so the gender issue that I am sure we are all well aware of, how it will be probably more problematic for young girls than it is for young boys to meet the challenges posed by this crisis. And then also for your comments on issues in terms of health services. I am sure that the students attending will have a lot of questions, in particular on how actually these new concessions and financing from the World Bank can be given actually to states. But let me first of all continue with our discussion, and let me introduce Domenico Fanitz, who is actually the Executive Director for Italy, Albania, Greece, Malta, Portugal, and San Marino to the International Monetary Fund. And this has been so since November 2018. He previously was the Executive Director at the African Development Bank between 2016 and 2018. So Dr. Fanitz, obviously the floor is yours, and I'm sure that your speech will deal with the fundamental role also of the International Monetary Fund in respect of dealing with this crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Scarpa. Let me also start by thanking Giampiero Massolo for inviting me to this event, and His Excellency Ambassador Sebastiani for hosting us and for his inspiring and very interesting remarks. I'm delighted to join this discussion on a topic I deeply care about, not only because I sit in the board of the IMF, a multilateral institution, but because I have strong convictions about it. I believe, if you allow me, that characterizing what is happening in the system of international relations more in general as a transition may be a bit of understatement. More likely, I would say that we are in the midst of a lasting upheaval. And that's to understand the depth of the transformation that we are witnessing. The main point, I think, of the discussion is that we have become more and more frustrated by the shortcomings of the international system built around the multilateral organization set up in the post-war period. This system now doesn't look adequate to deal with the complicated challenges we face. The collapse of the trade system centered around the World Trade Organization constitutes perhaps the most visible example of the alleged crisis of multilateralism. This is a general view that you read on the press all the time. I would like to make 2 points, basically, that may lead us to a more sanguine assessment, and like Roberta was saying, show us that multilateralism is far from that. First, this is, I think it's quite important. The resurgence of bilateralism in trade relations, for instance, China versus the US, does not necessarily imply that the multilateral approach does not work any longer. To the contrary, we need to understand we are not talking about 2 alternative approaches. Bilateral and multilateral trade liberalization are mutually necessary. The old multilateral approach has run into difficulties because it did not pay enough attention to underline bilateral imbalances. And that was a problem, we acknowledge it. This has also an important corollary. It is not sufficient to wave the flag of multilateralism to make it effective. Instead, we need to show that without multilateral action, bilateral trade liberalization will not succeed in its objective. So the idea is that we need to find a way in which the multilateral and bilateral approach live together in a self-reinforcing way, avoiding an ideological contraposition that does not lead us anywhere. And that's something that I'm deeply convinced about. Second, coming to the current challenges, I think that the current unprecedented economic crisis showed that the international multilateral cooperation is not only necessary, but also well alive, like Roberta was saying. After all, something exceptional has happened. Even the US have played ball. For instance, through the swap credit lines offered by the Fed to emerging markets. This has been a major action and has been toward multilateral cooperation that has stabilized market in a substantial way. Just to note, the fund itself, in response to the crisis, said created swap lines to provide financial support to emerging market on a very short-term basis. As a result of the action of the Fed, we never had to use them, and that's important. More in general, I think the crisis has taught us that synergies among all possible leaders are essential to build an effective response. This common sense of purpose has come clear from the last week, actually, IMF and World Bank annual meetings, where the message were basically two. First, that the extraordinary monetary and fiscal stimuli that we have experienced should not be withdrawn anytime soon, particularly in light of the latest development of the pandemic, of course. This seems something almost trivial. I mean, but it's incredible that the international community found itself fully agreeing on something like that. A few months back, that would have been unthinkable. We would have squabbled not only among different continents, but even within Europe. This is surprising, and it's certainly an important step and shows that cooperation and dialogue works. The second point is not less important, actually, is that the international community should step up its effort to help developing countries that, unlike our advanced economies, do not have the policy space to provide the needed support to the population and the economy. Many of these countries cannot afford the needed fiscal and monetary measures because of the pre-existing vulnerabilities or fixed exchange rate regimes that do not allow the use of unconventional monetary policy to finance spending, something that in Europe and the United States and Japan we are doing. So this is a major driver of inequality. The advanced world can deal with the adverse impacts of the crisis as described by Roberta, but emerging and low-income countries cannot. And for these countries, it's extremely costly. So when we think about what is happening in our countries, in our regions, we should think how deep the crisis is somewhere else in the world, where the resources cannot be used to support the economy. In this context, what has the fund done? The fund has played, I believe, a key role as a lender of last resort. It has lent $208 billion to 81 countries since March. It has also supported the G20 initiative to suspend debt service. I think now is until mid-2021. And called for the participation from commercial creditors, which unfortunately it has remained elusive. This is part of an important part of the efforts to avoid debt overhang in these countries, but these efforts include also facilitating debt restructuring in countries that cannot eventually afford to pay back, reorienting what we call emergency lending, what we have just done in response to the crisis, from emergency facilities that do not envision conditionality to traditional facilities, which actually includes include conditionality, meaning policy conditions and reform that aim to address long-standing policy-induced distortions. And this is important because we are moving from the emergency to try to act and restore growth on a sustainable manner. And that's quite important. Finally, it's also helping countries to build debt management capacities that, given the amount of increase of the debt, are essential. This has been possible thanks to the readiness of the fund membership, 89 countries that have all agreed to rise both access limit, how much countries can borrow, and fund resources, including those for the concession loan windows for low-income countries. And this is a remarkable effort for a multilateral system that we believe be in crisis. The fund has also stepped up its collaboration with other international financial institutions on urgent issues such as climate change and digitalization that are key to shaping the economic future after the pandemic. This is more or less what we have done. In conclusion, let me say that the ongoing crisis is changing the role of multilateral institutions. But I believe we cannot talk about their crisis. It looks to me the institutions have done a good job in quickly adapting to the new reality and challenges posed by the pandemic. I would not have expected that even 6 months back. And I would conclude in saying that we might have dismissed multilateralism a bit too early. Let me leave it to that, and thanks again for your attention, and I'll be happy to engage with whatever discussion you wish.
Thank you very much for for this very interesting highlight on the work of the IMF, of the International Monetary Fund, and for having emphasized the existence of multiple levels within the system of global governance. I think that all the students attending are well aware of the fact that we have multiple actors, that states are not any longer the only actors at the supranational level, and that we have a variety of ways through which then all the actors that are active at the supranational level can cooperate if they want to do so. Both the World Bank and the IMF celebrate this year their 76th anniversary. So the two Bretton Woods institutions were actually born during the Second World War. It was a moment of a crisis, as it actually is the moment of the current pandemic, probably a different kind of a crisis, but still it is true that it's at times also thanks to serious crisis that we have seen the birth of new institutions. The same probably for the United Nations, which was born a year later in 1945. As you say, it's probably interesting also to remember how Andorra this month joined the IMF, so becoming the 190 state member of the IMF, which means that, as you say, probably institutions and international organizations are alive. From my humble point of view, I see, as someone who has dedicated a lot of time studying international law, how there is probably focus by states more and more to divert from binding standards, hard standards, towards soft standards, or also soft frameworks, which might be an issue in a way, but still, as you say, I see very much the fact that we have a variety of ways, bilateral relations, multilateral relations, and then a variety of frameworks and international fora through which states can engage in the conversation, as well as obviously be joined by other actors. Let me introduce also our last speaker for today, His Excellency Father Augusto Zampini, who is an Argentine priest from Buenos Aires. He's currently working as Adjunct Secretary of the Dicastery for Integral Human Development of the Holy See. He was formerly a theological advisor to CAFOD, and he's a honorary fellow at Durham University, Roehampton University, and Stellenbosch University. Father Zampini, the floor is yours, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scarpa, and thank you very much to His Excellency Sebastiani for inviting me and for organizing this. And I'm glad to see so many young people on the screen. So I'm a bit excited about it. So I will share my screen if I can. Can you see my screen? It's okay. So
yes, we see it.
So let me start with a bit of following what His Excellency Pietro Sebastiani said, the states of affairs, to see why do we need this kind of new multilateralism. Our oikonomos, or economy, our administration of the house, as it was till now, is destroying our oikologos. In other words, our ecology. The model of international development that we have, based on a particular multilateralist system of multilateralism, is destroying our common home. So this is totally unsustainable, and it's creating a lot of problems. So that's why we need a new oikumene, a new dialogue among the people living in the planet. And you can see the same root, oikos, no? Oikonomos, oikologos, oikumene, which is oikos is in Greek home. No? So the way we're administrating the home is destroying actually our home, and that's why we need a new dialogue on our home. That's why we need a refreshed multilateral system. And that can help us to move away from the extractivist mentality, that we extract from the earth and from people, to produce, to trade, to consume and to throw away, as we have in the right hand of the screen, but linked with a globalization of indifference. So the model of globalization that we have is based on an extractivist model with a throwaway culture, creating a globalization of indifference. And this is an explosive combination that we have to really move away from it, as Ms. Gatti and Mr. Fanitza were saying. We need something new. This crisis is an opportunity. So why, so talking about political life in particular, look at what Pope Francis is explaining or describing in Fratelli Tutti in the latest encyclical. Political life no longer has to do with healthy debates about long-term plans, because it has this short-term mentality. No? It's neither related to improve people's life and to advance the common good, but only it is related, unfortunately, with slick marketing techniques, primarily aimed at discrediting others. And you can see what's happening in many debates, in many countries, but particularly in the most powerful countries. No? And with this kind of political life, we cannot create anything new, or at least we can create what the world needs. Now, it's true that there was a tendency after the World War II that Ms. Carpa mentioned, a tendency of integration. Look at the best example is the European Union. There were some attempts in Latin America, as the Mercosur, and in other regions. And we thought that we were moving towards gradually a more united planet or world. But actually, that's not the case, because we were moving ahead in an unfair way, and this has created an unjust unity, which is totally unsustainable. Look at the picture that you have, the cartoon that you have that. And what COVID crisis has done is to exacerbate this crisis of inequality, of the ecological crisis, and now we have a pandemic. No? So why I'm saying this? Because integration or multilateralism with individualism is impossible. So individualism, the Pope says, is a virus that needs to be cured. Multilateralism requires to go beyond your own interest to find a common interest or a common good. Otherwise, it's impossible. Otherwise, it's the rule. It's like Hegel. No? It's the rule of the strongest, including international relationships, as you know. And look at what's happening because we had created this unjust unity. Look at what is going on today, politically speaking, in the world. We have a distorted version of the liberty of the freedom of individuals, expressed in a neoliberal model. That, of course, freedom and liberty is important, but the distortion is a model that is totally centered in the individual and in individual interests, which is creating a lot of problems. And if we don't change this, we can put as millions of dollars as we want in aid, but it won't work. On the other hand, look at what's happening with populism. So the rise of national populisms, which is the distortion of the people, the distortion of what we have in common. So on the one hand, we have the distortion of liberty. On the other hand, we have the distortion of fraternity. No? And we have a globalization that is not working. So so this is the original ideas behind the liberty, fraternity, solidarity are a bit in trouble so we have to change. Because the COVID has showed something that we in the Vatican, and particularly in the Vatican COVID Commission, we have been insisted on. We are in the same boat. There's no way to get out of this crisis if we don't do it together, because if the other is infected, it doesn't help. This applies to the vaccine. That's why it's so important to have the vaccine for all, because otherwise the vaccine won't work. But we are in the same boat, but we live in the same home, the same planet, and we have the same blood. So this is you see how we need to start addressing the crisis, the health crisis, the ecological crisis, and the economic crisis. But of course, for the new multilateralism and to go out of the crisis in a different way that we get in, we don't want to get back to normal or to restart the economy. This is not what in the Vatican COVID Commission or in the Castri we want. We want to regenerate something new. We want to take this opportunity to change once and for all the roots of the crisis. And for that, in a multilateral system, we need dialogue and participation. But look at what the picture suggests. Dialogue with somebody that is very, very big and strong, with somebody that is weak, is impossible. No? Dialogue needs participation of everybody, particularly the voices that are left out. Dialogue, in a way, requires us is a way of sharing power. Sharing power and solidarity is helping us to get out of individualism. It's not just to give to the poor what they need. It's to share the power that we have to get out of this crisis and to help us, particularly once we have, not the ones we have, the ones we have not, to get out of individualism. Because together we can, if we want a true dialogue, we can do it in different ways, passionate, relaxed, but we need this participation beyond our self-interests. So the good news is that because we are all brothers and sisters living in the same home, in the same oikos, and we need a new hybrid system between public and private, states, international, civil society, etc. The good news is that we have, 5 years ago, not just Pope Francis issued a encyclical Laudato Si, but all nations, more than 190 nations, have agreed on a particular issue, the Paris Agreement and the following Sustainable Development Goals. This is one of the most important treaties, agreements in the history of humankind, because it's about the goals that we want for the next 50 years. These are the nations that agreed, and then we have to help nations to implement them. And of course, these 17 goals and more than 200 targets, and it's difficult to explain. But look at these 5 Ps that are in the preamble of the Agenda 2030. So we have to help to end poverty and hunger in all forms and ensure dignity and equality. People-centered goals, but ensure that our prosperity is fulfilling lives in harmony with nature, not destroying nature. Prosperity, I would say, in development, in partnership with others. That's why it's a hybrid system, new partnerships, protecting our planet, and that will generate peace. If there's a P that is not there, peace is impossible. Or in the words of Pope Paul VI, development, actual development of everybody is the new name of peace. Without that, we can add the protection of the environment. Without that, we cannot find true peace or new multilateralism. We'll have new wars. So, in a nutshell, what I would like to say is that we should stop sharing the screen. What I would like to say is that if we want to generate a new system, well, we need to do it with justice, with inclusion, and with participation. There's no way out without that. Because otherwise, then, even if it's something new, it will be more of the same, because it will be an imbalance of power. And I knew, for an example is the vaccine, and another example is the debt that both previous speakers mentioned. The vaccine, look at what's happening with the vaccine. So some countries are trying to buy all the vaccines available in order to, they want to decide who are they, who would be receiving the vaccine. Well, this is not conducive for new multilateralism. You see, we know that the leaders of countries have to ensure that the security of the citizens, but the COVID shows that security of the citizens is worthless if the security of our neighbors is not also healthy or secure. So the design of the vaccine, from the funding to the production and distribution, Ms. Gatti mentioned COVAX, but there are other people also working in the vaccines. We really need to find the vaccine that is cheaper, that is easy to produce, and is easy to implement. Probably we'll have different, but if we don't have this entire mentality of the development of the vaccine, we won't be able to get out of the crisis together. The same with the debt. The debt, well, we still have to find out how to calculate the ecological debt, where many countries have developed due to the exploitation of the natural resources of other countries, that has not been finalized or put it into numbers yet. So the cancellation of debts, we are improving a little bit of understanding that countries It's like a household. I lived 2 years in a shantytown, in a very, very poor neighborhood in Buenos Aires. If you ask the people, what is the most important thing for you in your life, they would say health. Because they know that any single disease, even if I remember a very old lady that her spectacles, her glasses were broken. She almost died because her glasses were broken. Because she was on her own, she can be. So every single tiny thing on you, tiny disease could be a disaster for your life, for your family, for your household. And in a poor country, it's the same. So if we really want to get out of the crisis together, we need to revisit the entire understanding of international debt. And this is where discussions we are having with all international organizations. The same with the creation of jobs and the same with the vaccine. There are 3 just examples of how to get a new oikumene. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Zampini. I think that what you said is very important in terms of justice, inclusion, and participation. Going back to this idea of global governance as a system, in which actors have a chance to participate, we see how there is not so much of an emphasis in finding solutions to problems. It's not a problem-oriented system, while actually it should become for solving major crises that you correctly mentioned in terms of the vaccine and the access actually to the vaccine for everybody, in terms of the issue of climate change, in terms of the problems of poverty, and the wall, the cartoon that you were showing in terms of half of the world, the world being divided, half actually full of people, the poorest ones, and then the richer ones, attempting with walls actually to stop the flow of migrants. I know that this is an issue that it's also very much close to your work. It's also very much close to my work as an instructor. So I think that these issues need to be emphasized. So definitely there is no solution to the issue of COVID-19 if it's not for everybody, but we're also not going to solve issues in terms of migration, in terms of the plight of people who are escaping, migrants, internally displaced persons, trafficking victims, if we are not in a way or another solving issues in terms of vulnerability. And definitely poverty as well as other vulnerabilities are at the heart of this discussion. Let me briefly only mention His Holiness Pope Francis, who a few days ago intervened to this TEDx event, and he said that actually the system is unsustainable because the current economic system is actually not working. How we produce, how we consume, how we think about our culture of waste, the short-term vision, the exploitation of the poor, indifference towards them, and the increasing inequalities and dependence on harmful energy sources. So somehow I think that His Holiness mentioned all the problems that you also correctly emphasized. Okay, I think that we have 15 minutes left for our discussion. So students attending, but also others attending the conference, if you would like to intervene and ask questions to our panelists, you are very much welcome to do so. Please keep it brief in terms of questions. Don't do very long actually speeches because we don't have time for that. But then also tell us to whom actually you would like to address your question. Thank you very much. I'm checking the chat. It seems that we don't have questions so far. Don't be shy. This is your chance to ask questions. If you don't do it, then maybe I can start with the first one. So let's see if any of the issues that I might be mentioning might be of interest to the students who might then get into the details of these issues. While actually our 2 experts from the Bretton Woods institutions were talking, I was thinking a lot about the reform of the Bretton Woods institutions, so the international financial institutions, as well as the reforms of the UN. My students were doing today their midterm exam on the reform of the United Nations Security Council. So somehow, this is an issue that they are very much aware of. And actually, one of the problems I see in the system of multilateralism and in many of these organizations is this imbalance of power that also His Excellency Father Zampini was mentioning. So some countries, usually Western ones, having more powers, and then others being relegated to a secondary role. And then again, how can we guarantee that in a way or another participation is assured, but is assured in an equal or a more equal way? And can COVID-19 be a chance to guarantee this greater equality in participation? This is both for Dr. Fanizza and Dr. Gatti.
Who wants to start, Roberta, or do you want me to start? Okay. Okay, I can say something on that. Yes, actually, it's even a bit worse than that. It's not only that there is an imbalance of power according to between advanced economies and developing economies. It is that it is not realistic any longer with respect to the criteria that had been used in order to establish what we call in jargon quotas, which is the stock of the fund. Now, let me be clear, is that I firmly believe that one of the reasons why the fund and the World Bank work in some effective way is because countries, they are not only equal in their representation. Because if you do that, it's like the European Union or the United Nations, taking any decision becomes extremely complicated. Sometimes it's good, but it becomes something very, very difficult to manage. So, but the reality is that the shares that countries have are not any longer what they would have if Bretton Woods would take place now. Because completely, the world has changed completely. So countries that, the more visible example is China, which is largely underrepresented. But there are other countries. Think about Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a country of 70, 80 million people. Huge country. It has, and with a GDP which is growing fast and politically important also. And its share is really teeny, not tiny, very, very, very small. So everybody agrees, unfortunately, that, well, I should say fortunately, everybody agrees that things need to be changed. But then when we start to discuss how it is going to be changed, it has practically proved completely impossible to achieve a solution, which does not mean that we will not. I hope actually the crisis might make it easier to get somewhere. And we have an exercise that takes place every certain number of years, every 5 years, which is review of quota. And in 2010, it was agreed that we would have done some changes that in the last 10 years, we have not been able to agree to implement them. To give you an idea of how difficult that is. And we have made efforts already. We have to acknowledge to give more voice, more representation to emerging countries. But I think at the heart of that, there is the difficulties for advanced economies to acknowledge the fact that the world has changed very, very fast, and the center is not any longer Europe or the US. And of course, a very political issue, and it's difficult to get our countries to acknowledge the reality in a sense. So that's sorry for being a bit pessimistic on the possibility of change in that, but actually things might change with the crisis. The few changes that have taken place in that direction have happened after the global financial crisis. So maybe we'll move. Roberta, do you want to chip in?
I finally managed to put the cursor on the unmute button. So thank you, Mimmo. And thank you, Dr. Scarpa, for the very good question. We have the benefit of having Dr. Fanizza reflecting from his position as executive director, and so being within the board of one of these institutions. Let me offer some reflections from the working level, which is what I see every day. And what I see from that is happening with the crisis is that although there is more threat to globalization and to integration, there is more need to come together with global public goods. The vaccine is one such global public good, and is one that deserves the cooperation of institutions and countries to speed up the production of the vaccine. Just a consideration related to the vaccine. Of course, the first dimension of the cost of not having a vaccine is the potential lives lost to COVID, and that's something that we should never forget. However, there's also an important economic dimension. Even if COVID is somehow contained, the fact that the virus is around and we don't have a vaccine is something that is going to make mute any economic recovery, because the global value chains will not work as they were supposed to work. People will not travel, people will not move, people will not demand goods as much as they would have done before. However, we all know that in the economics of vaccines, there are externalities that are very important. We're talking about contagious disease, and there are sort of hold-up problems, so that the firms that produce vaccines do not necessarily have the incentive to internalize the social benefits of having a vaccine around. In this case, the social benefits are dramatic and global. So in that sense, if I look at what the World Bank is doing, we as an institution have a model that is country-based. So whenever we work with a country, country authorities request engagements in the form of loans or grants or technical assistance, and we put our machinery to work to serve the country. But we also work at the global level, from anywhere from climate change, reducing the impact of fragility, and in this case, COVID, to help cooperation and coordinations, which are very important. So in that sense, I feel that although there are different angles that come to these moments of cooperation, and these are not easy, it's just because this coordination is not easy that it's so much more valuable when it happens. And so again, as I wanted to make my point that multilateralism is alive and kicking, I think that this is a moment when it can really bring gains of a global nature that are very high. I didn't manage to say it in my initial intervention, but I would like to make a point for a global good that tends to be the poor child of many other global goods, and that I think will continue to be important for cooperation and for basing interaction internationally and within nations on facts rather than fake news. And this is collaboration about measurement. I know that the Italian government invests a lot of measurement. As an Italian, I feel very proud of the Statistical Institute and the work that it does. And as a staff of an international institution, I spend a lot of time trying to convince countries and people that investing in measurement is a fundamental step towards triggering reforms and triggering cooperation about evidence, based on evidence rather than news. So as I'm concluding here, let me put like a quick seed of if you guys are interested in measurement and want to work on something that can help reforms being based on evidence and political processes to evolve in ways where this conversation might be geared towards the greater good. Working also on measurement can be one of those tools. So thank you for the great question, and over to you.
Thank you very much to both of you. I see that there was a hand raised by a student, Costanza, if I read well your name. If you would like to ask your question, then the floor is yours.
I hope you can hear me. My name is Costanza Palmer. I'm a second-year global governance student. And first of all, thank you all for your presentation. It was very interesting. And my question regards the shift towards multilateralism that is needed, and that, you know, it's obvious that we need the shift, especially now with the COVID pandemic. It's become more obvious. And my question was, what do you think we as individuals, as students, as future leaders, or anything any of us want to become, what could we do to achieve this in the future and make sure that this shift, let's say, happens? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Costanza. Was this directed to any of the speakers or to all of them?
Sorry, whoever wants to answer is great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone who is willing to answer to this? Dr. Gatti, maybe? No, I see that you're trying to unmute your microphone.
Sorry, I'm working on two screens. Here I think I should give you an answer that is part staff of an international organization and part mother of a college-age student. So if I were to give any advice, is really to get engaged, and get engaged with passion, and find which is the passion that you want to fight for. Be it climate change, fighting inequality, fighting poverty. I think that that's the most fundamental ingredient for the recipe to succeed. If I want to be a bit more nerdy, I would say that measurement is also something that will help you channel that passion into a sort of platform to have conversations with other students and with professors and with functionaries of international institutions based on facts. And that will for sure be helpful, and it won't be easy. But, you know, if it were easy, it'd be done. So don't shy away from fighting for something that you believe for. I just wanted to quote something that we see every year in the staff survey of the World Bank. You know, there are lots of complaints there, but there's an answer that always gets 99% approval. And it is the question, am I proud to work at the World Bank? And that's a question that I don't think that our answer historically ever gone below, I don't know, 97%, at least not in my lifetime at the World Bank. So there's a sense in which passion really can carry you far and can keep you going through difficulties. So that would be my advice. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gatti, for your passionate, in a way, speech in terms of also joining international organizations. I also say this to my students: find your way, find your passion, and then obviously fight in a way for it. I see His Excellency Father Zampini. Yes, the floor is yours. Who would like to say something as well?
Thank you, Costanza, for your question. I don't have the exact answer, but I have something that might help to all of us. When we are facing enormous crises, like the ones we are facing, crises, interconnected, normally, I mean, psychologically speaking, the attitude is to turn off, because it's so big that there's nothing I can do. So to counter that attitude, the only way of doing is to join others, apart from what Ms. Cathy was saying. I would like to join others, because individual passion won't lead you any further, but join others and look at what the Fridays, the strikes on Fridays of the young people are doing. But also even in universities, there's a lot of university students at present who are really, really eager to change the economic curricula, because they know that what they are being taught in economics is not helpful at all for the future. So we had that in all Catholic universities. In all Catholic universities, students are really, really claiming for a change. And the institutions don't know how to change, because, of course, the institutions, that would be a radical change. So, but this is something that also you can aim at, even if you are studying international relations or something related to economics, etc. But the networking is also important. And finally, in my experience, this is not advice, but just sharing my experience. When we are seeking for radical change, it's not going to be easy, as Mr. Fanisa was saying. No? It's not easy. And there are going to be millions of difficulties and drawbacks in the journey. So we need to find something that really, really keeps you focused, even in the middle of the difficulties. And sometimes passion can come and go, because sometimes you can feel, but really look at not just of your thinking, and it's very, very important, the measurements, I agree with that, and the studies, but also look at what you have in your hearts. No? The spiritual values, whether religious or otherwise, are really, really important to walk along this international reform that we need. Because the new multilateralism is looking very, very dark at present. So if you really want to have a better one for your future, for the future of your children, you really need to also try to listen to your heart or to your guts, not just to your mind and to your emotions. That's my experience. It's just a sharing more than an advice. Thank you.
So at this point, I will try to, if I may, add my 2 cents to these 2 important answers. I believe them I agree with both the answers, but I would like to say that it's also important to believe in dialogue and listen what other people's point of view. You cannot believe actually in multilateral cooperation if you do not make an effort to understand the point of view of other people, even if they are very different from yours. Keep open dialogues and do not let ideology to drive all your conviction. Passion, yes, ideology, not. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you very much to all our speakers for their tremendous contributions. If I can also give my 2 cents on this discussion as an instructor, I would rather say also a problem-solving mindset, which is very much needed. So challenge yourself in finding solutions to global problems. That's what I ask to my students. They do projects on this, and we try as much as this is possible to solve global problems. This helps in then, imagining how it would be the work of tomorrow, the one that they will be doing in the future. I think that our time is almost over. So before concluding this event, I would like again to go back to a few words of His Holiness Pope Francis, again coming from this TEDx meeting, in which he was again claiming that between continuing to ignore the suffering of the poorest and mistreat our common home, the earth, or committing ourselves at every level to transform our way of acting, everyone, so here the message is to both Christians or non-Christians, believer or non-believer, must feel called to make a significant contribution. So I think that the call is to all of us, whether you are religious or non-religious. I think that the challenges that we have today in terms of the pandemic, in terms of climate change, in terms of human rights violations happening all over the world, are so huge that they deserve our attention and our common action. And I'd rather say, since the question was coming from a young girl, that definitely there is also a need of gender equality in this. So definitely I particularly would like to thank Dr. Gatti for having joined us today. So I think that the gender component here is very important for having a sound discussion about these issues, as it was stated by Dr. Gatti. Maybe those who will be mostly affected in the developing world by the global pandemic are women, are young girls. Those who are going to end up without schooling, will end up being exploited. We know many of them will be women. So there is a huge need here to add to our perspective. Definitely, inclusion, non-discrimination on all grounds, but also gender component. Thank you very much. Thanks very much also to His Excellency Ambassador Pietro Sebastiani for having hosted this event. And for having started our conversation on this very interesting issue. I hope that there will be a follow-up to this event in the near future. So thanks very much to all of you, Dr. Gatti, Dr. Fanizza, and His Excellency Father Zampini for having joined us today, and also to the students for having contributed. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. God
Bye.
bless.
Bye-bye.